guys can be seated. Hey, if you've got a Bible this morning, I want to invite you to Luke chapter 19. That's where we're going to hang out together for a few moments today. Luke chapter 19. Hey, you'll notice in the seatbacks in front of you, church family, you'll notice these Georgia Barnett State Missions Offering envelopes. Today does begin the week of prayer for our partnership with other Louisiana Baptists for our state missions offering. And that money is all kept inside the state for church planting and church health and revitalization and disaster relief and a number of other things that we give into together outside of our normal offering times. And so if you would like more information on that, there's some prayer guides outside, or you're welcome to take one of those envelopes and consider what you and your family might give towards that offering, and we'd be much appreciative of that. That'll be all month long, but this week is the kickoff for that. And so, man, we're grateful for all of our partners in Louisiana, the things that we are able to do together. We as a church have influence in every corner of the state, not because we are there physically, but because of our partnerships throughout the state in places that are declaring the gospel in ways that it's being seen. And so I'm proud to be a part of a group of people who believe in the things that we're doing for the kingdom. And so I just encourage you with that, let you know about that. Today we are continuing. We started this last week looking at the three words we use to talk about First Baptist Church of Sterlington. And so last week I introduced to you the church at Antioch in Acts chapter 13, and we talked about how Antioch was the kind of the launch pad for the non-Jewish taking of the gospel the gospel going to the non-Jewish world. Let me get all that straight in my mind. So that they were the reason that you and I are here together. They were part of God's plan for the gospel to move from Jerusalem to the very ends of the earth. And so we looked at how God provided for them and what he gave them, what their responsibility was to him and walking in obedience, and how their obedience was what God used to multiply and to see the gospel grow exponentially around the world. And that mission, that purpose is yet to be finished. We're a part of this. We're in this story together. So we use the church in Antioch to kind of paint the picture of, hey, here's who we want to be. Here's kind of what we believe God's called us to in the scriptures. In the next few weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about these three words: engage, equip, and empower. It's the process that we use when we think about what we're doing and how we're programming and what we're preaching on or teaching on or what we're trying to do as a church locally. Now, this is kind of the process, and if you would, it's almost a discipleship process for us as we think through it. The first, I'll give you the quick overview, and then we're going to jump into the first word together today. The first word, engage, the one we'll talk about this morning, is really, we believe it's our purpose as a church to see people engaged with the gospel. We want them to hear the story of Jesus and to see its effects on our lives, and to let them know that that too can happen to them, that forgiveness of sins and new life are found in Jesus. And so we want to be an engaging church. The second part of that is equipping believers as disciples. We want you, as you call First Baptist home, man, we want you to feel like you are growing in your faith and you're being equipped to not just share the gospel, but to live it out. Now, one of the consistent themes over the last several weeks together as a church is, I have said to you, and I've been looking for in my own life, man, how might the gospel come and infiltrate every area of my life? From the hair on my head to the wiggle in my toes, man, how can the gospel infiltrate all that I am and all that God has called me to be? Because when we look at Scripture, this is the influence and the power of what Jesus does in a life. It doesn't just change your Sunday schedule. It changes everything about who you are. So we want to see the folks who call this place home equipped to walk in that and live that out. And then finally, the third one is empower. The word empower, for us, it's the idea that once we see someone engaged and we begin to equip them, that they will feel empowered to live in and through the gospel as part of God's mission to the world. That their life would become part of a bigger story. Your life would become part of a bigger story than what you've ever imagined. Those folks at Antioch had no idea that almost 2,000 years from then, that you and I would be a part of their legacy of faith. And yet here we are. They never even dreamed what God would do through their obedience, and yet you and I reap the benefits in some ways from them. And so who's behind us? Who might we live out and live for as we follow Jesus in all the things that we do? So we'll unpack those as we go. It is kind of an ongoing process for us as we think about engaging, equipping, and empowering. Our goal is not just for you to feel empowered. Our goal is for you to be empowered to engage someone who can be equipped, who can begin to live empowered. Does that make sense? It's a process for us as we think about these things together. So today what I want to do in Luke chapter 19 as we kind of jump into this first word, engage, is I want to give you the illustration of the life of Jesus. A moment in kind of his life where he displayed for us what it is to engage people with the gospel. How did he go about it, and how did he lead folks to have this changing encounter with him? The story that I'm going to use here in Luke 19, if you've been around church, probably even when you were small, you're familiar with this story about a man named Zacchaeus. And again, we're not going to sing the song. But if you've been around church for a number of years, maybe you are, let's just say, over the age of, I'm going to go 30, because that just feels old now, right? I'm well over 30, but I'm going to count you guys with me. 30, then you probably have heard the song about a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. The reason I don't want to sing it is I'm afraid that I will never get it out of my mind for the rest of the week. And I might be on the broadcast Friday night, Coach, singing about Zacchaeus, so I don't want to do that. But the story of Zacchaeus is kind of a familiar story. And so before we jump into it, I also recognize that maybe there's some of you in the room that you're like, I think I'm aware of this man named Zacchaeus. I kind of have an idea that he was a little fella or a short fella, but I don't know a lot about him. So let me just give you some things that we're going to read about in a moment that kind of will help us to understand who this Zacchaeus is and why does he matter in our lives. Actually, let's do it this way. Let's read about it, then I'll come back and I want to tell you about Zacchaeus and things that Luke says about him. Beginning in Luke chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. Luke's telling us about Jesus and says, he entered Jericho and was passing through. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich, and he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Let me tell you a little bit about Zacchaeus from what Luke says about him. Zacchaeus' main role in life is that he is a chief tax collector. And I don't know what your kind of level of Bible knowledge is and how much you know about what a chief tax collector is, but that doesn't mean that he was just in charge of collecting taxes. He wasn't just at the top of his game. Zacchaeus, by what Luke records for us, is a Jewish man. And as a Jewish man, he has been raised up in and around the Word of God. As a small child, he's been taught the history of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. And so he is a Jew by nature and by birth. He's a part of this family of origin, if you would. But in the world in which Zacchaeus has grown up, the Roman Empire is in full swing. And the Romans now occupy and control all of the land of Israel. They are the premier power on the earth at this point in human history. And so the Romans, and one of the things they would do when they would conquer different territories or different areas is that they would find people from that people group to work for them. And so Rome has found this guy, Zacchaeus, and told Zacchaeus, hey, here's what we need you to do. We want you to collect taxes for us. It was one of the ways that Rome funded all the things that they did in history. They used the monies from the people that they conquered. And so Zacchaeus' role is to collect taxes. And I know what you're thinking. Hey, that's maybe you don't like taxes, but you kind of understand it, so somebody has to collect it. But here's where it took a turn for Zacchaeus. Rome would come to a man like Zacchaeus and say, look, we want you to collect taxes. As the empire, we're going to say, and I'm just going to use a number, we're going to say 10%. I want you to collect 10% from people for taxes for our empire, our military, our road systems, all those things. 10% is what every person will owe. Okay. But then they would say to Zacchaeus, but not only that, you collect 10% for us, but we're going to give you the authority, we're going to give you the power to collect as much as you want to on top of that. So if you think that if Rome said 10%, Zacchaeus can say, you know what, Rome needs 10, but Daddy needs a new horse, and so I'm going to ask you for 25%, right? So we're going to collect more money. Now, this is a Jewish man living amongst the Jewish people who's now working for Rome and taking advantage of the rest of his brothers and sisters. Zacchaeus is not a guy that you want around. As the chief tax collector, Zacchaeus is given all of this authority, and then there are people who now work for him to collect whatever it is that he wants. And then they, working for him, could do the same thing. So if you are a Jew in this time period, people like Zacchaeus are not who you want around. Zacchaeus kind of is like, and if you work for the IRS, I'm sorry, but kind of is like how we view the IRS sometimes, right? It's one thing to get your tax bill around April or in the first of the year and to look at it, okay, I owe this much. But can you imagine somebody locally calling you and say, hey, look, I know your tax bill is X, but I really feel like I need a beach house this year, and so I need you to pay X and Y. Right? Your gut reaction to that is, not happening, Jimmy. I'm not writing you an extra check. You're getting the one check. But what Rome did for Zacchaeus was, hey, you don't just have to ask for it. If people won't pay it, we will enforce it for you. We're going to give you soldiers, and we're going to give you people that you can imprison folks with and do things with. Zacchaeus is not a very likely candidate for what we just read in this story. He's a man that doesn't seem like anyone would want anything to do with, much less this encounter with Jesus that we're going to read about, or that we just read about. And so Zacchaeus is a chief tax collector, and of course Luke records for us that he was rich, which means he's been really good at getting people to pay him whatever he wanted. And so because that's Zacchaeus' story, there's a few things I think that we can kind of observe, and we read about in the text, and even as you think about who he is, if you are a person who is always demanding more from those around you, you probably find yourself as somebody who feels very, very alone. And Zacchaeus is a person that's alone. Sure, he's got employees, and he's got this group of guards that Rome has given him, but he's alone. Nobody wants to hang out with Zacchaeus. If Zacchaeus finds out that you bought a new fishing pole, he's going to ask you for a little more. He might ask you for the fishing pole. I mean, nobody wants this guy around. He's alone. The second thing that I would say to you, based on what kind of transpires here, is that Zacchaeus, not only is he alone, but he's a man that was never satisfied. He continued to defraud. He continued to take more than was necessary. Because he just thought, maybe if I had just a little bit more, maybe if I just had a little more authority, maybe if I did just a little bit better job, maybe if I had just a little bit more money, then I could sleep better at night. And the third thing I think that is true is Zacchaeus has heard about Jesus. He's not sure about Jesus. He's not sure who Jesus is or why Jesus should matter. But Zacchaeus, based on the story in verse 3, Zacchaeus wants to see who this Jesus is. I used to think that Zacchaeus wanted to get close and just hear from Jesus, but the text says that Zacchaeus wants to see who Jesus was. He wants to lay eyes on this guy. Well, if he's a tax collector, one of the first reasons I would think he wants to lay eyes on Jesus is to see if Jesus has come by any of his tax booths, right? Like maybe Jesus owes him some money. Maybe it's time for Jesus to pay up. And so Zacchaeus wants to look at him. But I don't think that's the heartbeat of the story. I don't think that's really what's unfolding here, because Zacchaeus so wants to see Jesus that he climbs up in a tree to lay eyes on Jesus as Jesus begins to come by that place. And then here's where the story gets interesting, where Jesus begins to show us what it looks like for us to engage people with the gospel. And so if you're a note taker, number one, here's the first thing we see in the life of Jesus that we need to imitate. Number one, we must be intentional with our time. Verse 5 says that when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus. Now, Jesus is a man who, throughout the Gospel of Luke, and even as you read the other Gospel accounts, there are a lot of people who needed and who wanted the time of Jesus. If you were a sick person, Jesus had the authority and the power to heal whatever ailed you, whatever sickness was dominating you. Jesus was a man who would go to funerals. And the funeral would turn into almost a birthday party, right? Because he would raise the dead. He was a man that when the hungry needed to be fed, he could take a little and make it a lot and satisfy the hunger pains that people were feeling. And so there's so many people who needed the time with Jesus. And yet in this moment, he comes to this place where a chief tax collector is in a tree, and he stops and he says to him, come down and I need to go to your house. What is Jesus doing? Why would he engage with this man? Why would he stop everything else? And then when you go back to the beginning of verse 1, what did Luke tell us Jesus was doing in Jericho? Was he coming to Jericho to spend the night? Was he looking for the best Airbnb that was in Jericho? Was he coming for a good meal? No, it says he was passing through, which means Jesus has somewhere to be. And yet there's a man in Jericho who doesn't deserve it, but who was looking for Jesus, and Jesus intentionally stops everything to be with this man. He stops everything, and he takes the time that he's been given to encounter Zacchaeus, and for Zacchaeus to encounter him. Church, when I look at the life of Jesus, I think about what he's called us to be. Man, I want to be so intentional with the time that you and I are given. And I want us to be a people who learn to live intentionally with the time that we have. And so when we think about worship services, or we think about small groups or events and things that we're doing, one of the things that we as a church want to be sure of is that we're not wasting time on things that don't matter. We want to be intentional. We want you to be intentional with what you expect and what you come seeking the Lord for, what you come wanting to desire to encounter God together. We want to be intentional with our time. But then on a personal level, we want to live out examples that cause us to live intentionally with our personal time. Now, a lot of you know, in my family, we're in kind of this new season of life where our oldest has just graduated in May and has moved to Baton Rouge. And it has been a different experience over the last few weeks, going to a restaurant and used to say, hey, I need a table for 5, and now I only need a table for 4. My debit card likes that somewhat, but it's still different, right? It's only 4 of us. And so there's this kind of this thing of some reflection that's been happening in my own heart. And Jen and I have talked about this some, like the last 18 years of her life. Were we intentional enough? Did we do enough? Have we invested the right things? And then here's the other piece of this that I think about when it comes to Jesus in this moment. Why was Jesus so intentional? Why was he so intentional everywhere he went? In fact, there's numerous times throughout the gospel where the writers will tell us that Jesus was passing through somewhere. But almost always, you find this next statement, but then he stopped and had a conversation, or you find that idea. So in Samaria, in John chapter 4, he had to pass through Samaria. Pass through, again, there's the idea. And yet, what does he do? He stops at a well and has a conversation with a woman that not only changes her life, but changes the entire village. Like over and over, we're told he's going somewhere, and yet he was intentional time after time. Why? Well, one of the advantages to Jesus being Jesus was he knew that after 33 years, his life was up, that he was going to a cross. He knew the day and he knew the time that all those things were going to play out. And so there was an intentionality to, hey, I've only got a short window. I've got to do everything the Father has required of me. Now, I recognize that you and I, we don't have that quote-unquote advantage. We don't know. We don't know how much time we have. We hope we do, right? We make plans for down the road and all those things, and I'm not trying to depress you, but the reality is we just don't know. We don't know how much time. But let me ask you this question. If you did, if today before you left, you were to get an email or a text message that said, hey, you've got 12 years. Hey, you've got 30 years. Hey, you've got 1 hour. Would you do anything different with that time that you were given if there were an end date on it? Man, as I've thought about that in my own heart, in my own life, the reality is, yeah, there's a list of things. In fact, we jokingly call that list what? A bucket list. I want to do these things before I kick the bucket, right? But here's I just want to give you the news. This is not good news, bad news. Do with it what you may. Whether or not you know that you have an expiration date, you do. Life has an end time. It has a start time and it has an end time. The question is, how will I live in the meantime? How will I live between the moment the time that I've been given at my house with my daughter? I'm looking back and saying, man, how was I intentional? Was I intentional enough? And now I'm looking at my kids that are still in my home saying, how do I make the most of these moments? Why? Because I know there's coming a moment where they won't be under my roof anymore. And so it kind of forces you to look at the time you have and say, hey, what am I doing with it? We don't have to have the date to begin to live intentionally. We just have to have the knowledge that the reality is that there is an end date. There is an expiration date. And if you answered the question a moment ago with some things, hey, if I knew, here's what I would do. The question is, why aren't you doing them? Or why aren't you doing them? What conversations would you have? What things would you invest in? What do you want your life to be known for? Jesus gives the example here with Zacchaeus of being intentional with this time. He stops at a tree when everybody else would have said, don't waste your time. But for Jesus, he knew that this moment mattered. And so as a church, if we're going to engage people with the gospel, we need to be intentional with our time corporately and with our time individually. But then here's the second thing. Not only do we have to be intentional, but part of that is learning to be present with people. Jesus stops at this tree and calls Zacchaeus by name, which tells me two things. The first thing we've learned already is that Zacchaeus has some awareness of who Jesus is. That's why he wants to see him. But in verse 5, you find out that Jesus has some knowledge of Zacchaeus. That Jesus knows who this guy is. He knows at least partially, well, he's Jesus, so he knows all the story, but in a relational experience, he knows something about Zacchaeus. The name Zacchaeus is attached to chief tax collector. And so Jesus knows the heart. He knows the story of Zacchaeus, and yet he stops and he doesn't just say, Zacchaeus, come down because I need to correct what you've been doing. Zacchaeus, come down out of that tree and I need to tell you where you've gotten your belief system wrong. Zacchaeus, I need you to come down out of that tree and I need to give you all kinds of correction from God. Instead, Jesus stops and says, Zacchaeus, I just want to hang out with you today. I want to go to your house and I want to have a meal with you. I want to sit down at your table and engage in conversation with you. And all of a sudden, the ears of Zacchaeus hear this invitation from a man that he's only heard things about. And what is the response of Zacchaeus? He comes flying down out of the tree, jumping down on the ground to go and to take Jesus to his home and to begin this conversation. Now I want you to think about if you're Zacchaeus. I've told you that he was a Jewish man who basically has betrayed his countrymen because he's working for Rome. Why would you ever come down out of the tree and receive Jesus joyfully? Why would you think Jesus would ever want to go to your house? This was the furthest thing from the mind of Zacchaeus. There's no way that that guy wants to be with me. All Zacchaeus was hoping for was to see Jesus, and now he's looking down from his tree, having this invitation extended to him. What is Jesus doing? He's being present. You know there was a disciple that was standing there that was like, Jesus, this is a bad idea. Like, we don't need to have dinner with that guy. Like, maybe one of the local religious leaders we can debate and we can learn some things from. Maybe I've got a cousin that, man, I'd love to introduce you to, and he fries the best fish in the whole region. Like, we could go sit at his house. But Jesus has stopped for this guy for this moment. The story of Zacchaeus should have kept Jesus from him, and instead, Jesus chose to step into it, to be present with Zacchaeus, to know what was going on and to step into Zacchaeus' story and to extend him something that maybe Zacchaeus had never had, or maybe it had been a really long time since somebody actually wanted to be around Zacchaeus. What's interesting is Jesus is kind of leading this whole moment. He's talking to Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus comes down out of the tree, and you know, that whole imagery for me is a little weird. Like, I remember being a kid and singing the song, and Zacchaeus comes down out of the tree, and he goes and he has the dinner with the Lord and all those things. But think about this. He's a chief tax collector who's wearing chief tax collector clothes, which are not necessarily tree climbing clothes, right? And so this man of importance and influence and affluence comes out of this tree. You know he snagged some things on the way down, and now he's standing before Jesus, and probably his robe is a little torn, and his hair is a little messy. Maybe there's a tree branch kind of hanging out, and he's just like, man, we got to go to my house. Jesus, you want to hang out with me, then I want to go with you, and I want to be a part of what you're doing, or I want to hear what you have to say. And all of this is taking place, and then you get to verse 7. Jesus is showing us how to be present with people, but in verse 7, we find a people who just really didn't want to be present with anybody they disagreed with. Verse 7, Luke just records and says, and when they saw it, they all grumbled. He's gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. I think in most of my readings of this story, I always assumed that the they was just the religious leaders. Why do I assume that? Because the accusation that they give, he goes in to be, or gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner, is the same accusation they throw at Jesus almost every time he does something like this. But in most cases, Luke, Mark, Matthew, even John, they identify for us in the context who the they are. Here, Luke leaves it very, very general and just says they, which leads me to believe that it's not just the religious leaders, although we know that it is partially them. But it's even the followers of Jesus who are like, here we go again. Here we go again. Jesus, what are we doing? We don't have time. Zacchaeus is not going to help your reputation. Jesus, he's not going to help us move the mission forward. We've got better things to get to, and yet Jesus is trying to show them there is nothing better than seeing one person go from death to life. And the only way that this conversation that's going to unfold in verse 8, the only way that we can get to that part of the story is if Jesus is present with Zacchaeus. He can't do a drive-by saving. He can't just go by the tree and throw some grace dust up into the tree. And now, Zacchaeus, you're all good. Don't worry about the story. Don't worry about what to believe. Don't worry about following me. You're good now. No, Zacchaeus, you've got to come down and I got to spend some time with you. And Jesus stops it all to be present with Zacchaeus. Church, one of the most difficult things for us to do as a church right now in this current culture and climate of running and gunning and full calendars is just learning to do what Jesus did in this moment, to just be present with people. We've got things to do, right? Like, I don't have time to really get into your story, or you say the same about me. I don't really have time to get to a personal level with you. Like, it's cool that we can nod and we see each other in Walmart and we can wave or whatever, but I don't have time. And yet we sit in jobs and we sit in cars and road trips and we sit in ballparks where there is time for us to learn to just be present. And when we're present, to do something that matters. Jesus knew the story of Zacchaeus, and instead of being offended by it, he ran to him. If we're going to engage people with the gospel, then we've got to learn to be present with people. One of the great things that God's done at First Baptist over the last several years is he's allowed us to have influence and opportunity within our culture and our community. We got people in almost every facet of the job force and the workforce in our community. We got people in every school, people in the ballparks, people in all of the jobs and restaurants. Why would God do that? Why would God bring this group of people together right now? Because there's some Zacchaeus among us that are trying to get into a tree just to see him. And God's put us in a place to be that tree for somebody if we could learn to be present with them. And then here's the final thing. If we're going to engage people with the gospel, then number 3, we must learn to trust the gospel's power. Now, to me, when Luke writes this story, at the end of verse 7, you have all this grumbling. And then in verse 8, you have this incredible response from Zacchaeus. He stands up and he says to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone, then I will give them fourfold," or restore it fourfold. Then Jesus makes this announcement. "Today salvation's come to this house, since he also is the son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." There seems like there's a whole lot missing between verse 7 and verse 8. Like, surely this is not just Jesus walking in the room, sitting down, and the meal's so good that Zacchaeus stands up and says, "Lord, that was so good, I'm just going to follow you with everything I got. I'm going to give away half. I don't know what's in your checking account, but I don't have very many expenses, or I want half to be what I have to pay for something." But he says, I got to give half to the poor, which means they're not going to earn it. They're not going to come to him. Zacchaeus is going to go find them and give them half of what he has. And then he says, not only am I going to give half of it away, but then if, and I really believe this is Luke trying to say, guys, this is really just rhetorical. There is no if here. If I've defrauded anyone, chief tax collector, taking whatever I want, becoming rich on your back, if I've defrauded anyone, I'm going to give it back fourfold. Somebody said to me at the first service, they said, "Hey, you realize that Zacchaeus was probably the first tax refund, right?" I was like, that's pretty good. Defrauded, and instead of giving you what you paid in, I'm going to give you 4 times that. Like, I would like that come April. Wouldn't you? This is what Zacchaeus does. I'm going to give fourfold to anybody that I've defrauded. In my mind, Zacchaeus doesn't have anything left. I don't have anything left. I'm taking everything from who I was, and now, Jesus, I'm going to give it all away, and I'm going to come and be with you. I'm going to come and follow you. What happened between verse 7 and verse 8? Well, I think you have to go back to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus to know that between verse 7 and verse 8, Jesus told Zacchaeus something that caused him to want to give his whole life to it. Jesus told Zacchaeus something that said, who you've been does not have to be who you will be. What you have done does not have to define where you are going next. What is it that Jesus could have possibly told this man of influence and affluence about his life that would cause him to give it all away and come with Jesus? Mark chapter 1 tells us that Jesus, after John the Baptist dies, that Jesus begins his public ministry, and here's what he preached. He preached, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent, therefore, and believe the gospel. What Mark was doing in the beginning of Mark was shaping the conversations that Jesus would have throughout the gospel accounts, telling us that Jesus told Zacchaeus why he had come. In fact, when you get to verse 10, isn't that exactly what we hear from the mouth of Jesus? He says to Zacchaeus, salvation has come to your house, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus was present, he was intentional, so that the gospel's power could be present and working in the life of Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus in verse 8 is responding to the reality that God has come close in the person of Christ and is now offering him forgiveness and new life. And when Zacchaeus hears the invitation and experiences the presence of God, Zacchaeus' life is forever changed. And everything has to go. Church, what we need to learn again, what we need to pray for, what we need to aim for in our everyday life and in our times together as a gathered church, we need to aim for seeing and trusting the power of the same gospel that Jesus preached and he delivered to the world. This is what it is to pray. God, engage people with the gospel. God, you have engaged me with the gospel. You've forgiven my sin. Jesus, you've given me new life because you lived, you died, and you rose again. You've given me the gift of your Spirit to live out the things that you've called me to. And this is the life you've given me. And so, Jesus, I want to trust the power that you've displayed in me is now the power that you want to display through me. And Jesus says, my mission was to seek and to save the lost. And when you get to the end of the life of Jesus, the same mission he gives to us as his church. To go everywhere seeking and telling the story so that he might save one more. And church, as you and I think about the days ahead, I'm telling you, our goal cannot be just how big can our church get. Our goal cannot be how much money can we collect. Our goal cannot be how comfortable can we make our worship services. Our goal must be that one more hears the gospel. Our goal must be that our community would become a place that people would look at and say, you know what, that's a place that I don't know all there is to know about Jesus, but they're marked and they're different by something, and it has to be this person of Christ. And like Zacchaeus, they're just trying to catch a glimpse of it. And the way that they'll catch a glimpse of it is by our lives and our obedience to him. And so we've been called as First Baptist Church of Sterlington to engage people with the gospel, to see people experience the same love and the same forgiveness that we see within the life of Zacchaeus in this moment. Engage people with the gospel. Would you pray with me this morning? Father, I'm reminded this morning that God, your word tells us that in the gospel we find the power of God for salvation. That God, you have chosen in the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ, you have chosen to give forgiveness to those who don't deserve it. God, all of us, no matter what our history is, no matter what our life story has been, all of us, like Zacchaeus, we're on the outside looking in, separated from you, and you came seeking us. You came to save us. And Father, I'm so grateful for so many in this room whose story is that Jesus saved me. He forgave me. He's given me new life. And it's been up and down, but consistently I've seen the faithfulness of God in my life. And Father, I pray that our church would continue to be people who don't get tired of hearing that story or being a part of that story. That God, in the ways that we dream together, the ways that we pray together, that follow the mission, the heartbeat, God, your heartbeat, wouldn't get lost. But that, Father, we would see you seeking and saving the lost through us in the places that you've called us and planted us. God, it's no mistake that we've all found ourselves together here in this community. God, it's a part of your plan. And it's still the invitation of you for us to join you in what your heart is. So, God, would you help us to be a people who have been engaged and who now seek to engage others with the beauty and the power of your gospel. In Jesus' name, amen.